Okay, so we need to talk about what happened at 9:23 this morning in the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, because what I'm about to tell you represents the most calculated institutional strike Princess Anne has executed in her entire 53-year career as a working royal. And if you think you understand the power dynamics inside the British monarchy based on what you've seen in the carefully managed press coverage over the past 6 months, you are about to discover that everything you thought you knew about who actually controls the levers of the crown was completely wrong. At exactly 9:23 a.m. London time, while Queen Camilla was 3 floors below preparing for what the court circular would later describe as a routine engagement with the Commonwealth Literature Council, Princess Anne walked into the king's private study, carrying a single manila folder marked with a royal cipher and the words "Constitutional Review minus urgent." King Charles was sitting at his desk, reviewing the morning briefings from his private secretaries, when his sister placed that folder directly in front of him without a word of greeting, without the usual family pleasantries, and said 4 words that have fundamentally altered the trajectory of his reign. "We need to talk." What Anne had discovered through a process of meticulous institutional archaeology that had taken her the better part of 8 months to complete was a systematic restructuring of the Crown's discretionary funding mechanisms that had been operating entirely below the radar of public scrutiny, and, more importantly, entirely outside the constitutional oversight framework that has governed royal finances since the Sovereign Grant Act of 2011. The details are complex, but the core of what Anne uncovered is this. Queen Camilla's private office had been quietly renegotiating the operational charters of 47 separate crown endowments, heritage trusts, and charitable foundations, gradually transferring final signatory authority from the sovereign's direct control to a newly created administrative body called the Royal Patronage Coordination Committee. On paper, this looked like exactly the kind of modernization initiative that the Palace Communications team loves to highlight: streamlined administration, reduced bureaucratic redundancy, more efficient allocation of royal resources. But the mechanical reality of these changes was that Queen Camilla, as the committee's permanent chair, now held effective veto power over the distribution of approximately £127 million in annual crown funding. She was not just influencing which charities received royal patronage, she was controlling which institutions received the financial backing that makes royal patronage meaningful in the first place. This was not a gradual accumulation of influence through personal relationships and strategic positioning. This was a deliberate, systematic transfer of constitutional authority executed through legal mechanisms so arcane and procedural that even the king's own treasury advisors had failed to recognize what was happening until Anne's investigation brought it to light. And the most sophisticated part of the entire operation was its timing. The final legal approvals were scheduled to be rubber-stamped by the Privy Council on December 15th, just 2 weeks away, at which point the restructuring would become irreversible without triggering a full parliamentary inquiry into the Crown's financial governance. Princess Anne had spent her entire adult life watching the institution she serves navigate crisis after crisis, scandal after scandal, always managing to emerge with its essential authority intact because, at crucial moments, someone inside the system was willing to make the hard decisions necessary to preserve institutional integrity over personal comfort. She had watched her mother make those decisions for 70 years. She had watched Charles struggle with them throughout his time as heir, and now, at the most critical juncture of the new reign, she was watching her brother fail to make them at all. The conversation that followed in the king's study lasted 47 minutes, and according to sources who were briefed on its contents immediately afterward, it was the most direct constitutional confrontation between senior royals in modern memory. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not make emotional appeals about family loyalty or personal relationships. Instead, she methodically walked Charles through the legal and constitutional implications of what his wife's office had been orchestrating, using language so precise and so devastating that, by the time she finished, the king understood that he was facing not just a family crisis, but a potential constitutional emergency. The document Anne had brought with her was a formal invocation of the Royal Consent Protocol, a rarely used but absolutely binding constitutional mechanism that requires unanimous approval from the three most senior blood royals for any restructuring of Crown financial authority that could affect the line of succession. By attempting to consolidate discretionary funding control without securing the formal consent of Princess Anne and Prince William, Camilla's private office had not just violated internal protocol, they had technically breached the foundational terms of the Crown Estate's parliamentary charter. Anne had already secured William's signature on the invocation document. She placed it in front of Charles and explained his options with the clinical precision of a constitutional lawyer delivering a legal ultimatum. He could sign the document, immediately halt the committee restructuring, and allow Anne to conduct a full internal audit of the Queen Consort's financial operations. Or he could refuse to sign, at which point Anne would be constitutionally obligated to refer the matter to the Parliamentary Accounts Committee for external investigation. The trap Anne had constructed was absolute. If Charles chose to protect his wife by blocking the internal review, he would be forcing a public, televised parliamentary inquiry into how the Queen Consort had been secretly redirecting Crown assets to build her own independent power base. The resulting constitutional crisis would make the abdication crisis of 1936 look like a minor administrative disagreement. The monarchy's entire funding model, its tax-exempt status, its relationship with Parliament, all of it would be subject to hostile scrutiny in an environment where Charles would have no control over the narrative or the outcome. At 10:10 a.m., King Charles signed the document. What happened next unfolded with the mechanical precision of a constitutional process that had been designed centuries ago to handle exactly this type of crisis. At 10:15, Anne's private secretary placed a call to the Lord Chamberlain's office, formally requesting an emergency session of the Household Financial Review Board. At 10:22, similar calls went out to the private offices of Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Earl of Wessex. By 10:30, the most senior figures in the royal household understood that Queen Camilla's financial operations were under formal institutional review, and that Princess Anne was personally overseeing the process. The Queen Consort herself was not informed of these developments until 11:47 a.m. when she returned from her Commonwealth Literature Council engagement to find Anne waiting in her private sitting room. What followed was a conversation that palace insiders are describing as the most one-sided exercise of institutional authority they have witnessed in decades. Anne did not negotiate. She did not explain. She simply informed Camilla that her discretionary funding authority had been suspended, that all financial initiatives originating from her office would require dual authorization from Anne's representatives, and that she would be expected to provide full documentation of every funding decision made over the past 18 months. The constitutional mechanism Anne had deployed was so obscure, so deeply embedded in the monarchy's foundational legal structure, that Camilla's advisors had no counterstrategy available. They could not appeal to the king because he had already signed the review authorization. They could not challenge the process through normal palace channels because Anne was operating with full constitutional authority. They could not even attempt to manage the situation through media relationships because the entire review was being conducted under parliamentary privilege, making any public discussion of its details a potential contempt of Parliament charge. By noon, Queen Camilla had been effectively placed under institutional receivership, with every aspect of her financial operations subject to oversight by the one person in the royal family who has never, in 53 years of public service, compromised her standards for political convenience or personal relationships. The immediate practical implications of Anne's intervention are staggering. Every charity that had been counting on Camilla's support for upcoming funding decisions is now in limbo. Every media relationship that had been carefully cultivated through strategic financial partnerships is suddenly uncertain. Every long-term project that had been planned around Camilla's expanding influence is now subject to review by someone who measures institutional value in decades, not news cycles. But the broader constitutional implications are even more significant. What Anne has done is reassert the fundamental principle that in the British monarchy, blood royals hold ultimate institutional authority over consorts regardless of titles, regardless of personal relationships, and regardless of how uncomfortable that hierarchy might be for the individuals involved. She has reminded everyone inside the palace and everyone watching from outside that the Crown's authority derives from constitutional legitimacy, not from personal popularity or strategic positioning. The response from Camilla's supporters has been predictably furious, but also tellingly ineffective. They cannot challenge Anne's constitutional authority without challenging the monarchy's foundational legal structure. They cannot question her motives without implicitly acknowledging that there were legitimate concerns about Camilla's financial operations. And they cannot appeal to family solidarity without admitting that Camilla's actions had created a situation where family solidarity was in direct conflict with institutional integrity. King Charles, meanwhile, has spent the day in what palace sources are describing as strategic seclusion. He understands that Anne has saved him from a constitutional crisis that could have destroyed his reign, but he also understands that she has done so by systematically dismantling the power structure that his wife had spent years building. The king, who wanted to modernize the monarchy by giving his consort unprecedented influence, has been forced to watch his sister restore the traditional constitutional balance that makes such modernization impossible. The most remarkable aspect of this entire operation is how completely invisible it has been to the outside world. The court circular for today lists Princess Anne's activities as private engagements within the royal household. Queen Camilla's schedule proceeded exactly as planned, with no indication that anything unusual had occurred. The palace's official communications have maintained their usual tone of institutional stability and family unity. But inside the building, everyone understands that the power dynamic of the current reign has been fundamentally altered. Princess Anne has demonstrated that she remains the ultimate guardian of the monarchy's constitutional integrity, capable of deploying legal mechanisms so sophisticated and so devastating that even a queen consort with years of strategic preparation cannot defend against them. She has reminded her brother, her sister-in-law, and everyone who works within the royal household that institutional authority in the British monarchy is not negotiable, not transferable, and not subject to the kind of gradual erosion that Camilla's operation had been attempting to achieve. The question now is not whether Camilla will recover from this intervention. The constitutional review process that Anne has initiated will take months to complete, and its findings will determine not just the queen consort's future financial authority, but her entire position within the institutional hierarchy of the monarchy. The question is whether the royal family can maintain the appearance of unity and stability while Anne systematically audits every aspect of Camilla's operations, and whether Charles can continue to function as an effective monarch while his wife operates under the direct oversight of his sister. What Princess Anne accomplished this morning was not just a family intervention or a personal power play. It was a constitutional restoration executed with surgical precision by someone who understands that the British monarchy's survival depends not on popularity or public relations, but on the unwavering maintenance of the legal and institutional frameworks that have allowed it to endure for 1,000 years. And anyone who thought that Princess Anne had mellowed with age, or that her influence within the family had diminished, now understands exactly how wrong they were. The Crown's authority has been restored to its constitutional foundation. Queen Camilla's independent power base has been systematically dismantled, and Princess Anne has once again proven that when the institution she has served her entire life faces a threat to its integrity, she remains the most formidable defender it has ever had.